In this video lecture, we're going to start talking about the cellular weapons of your second line of defense. All right, and so if you go back and review that diagram from your textbook, which is showing you how the different types of blood cells or formed elements develop in the bone marrow, we're going to be focusing in on most of your leukocytes except for the lymphocytes. We're not going to be talking about those. Your second line of defense includes those other types of leukocytes. So we're going to be mainly talking about neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils, and your monocytes in this particular lecture, second line of defense. So again, just as a review, your second line of defense includes weaponry that acts non-specifically and also immediately. So there's not a delay for the development of these weapons that are going to help you fight off infections. They're always poised and ready to go. And again, non-specifically means that these cells have ways of detecting and reacting against microorganisms in general. So there are certain features that bacteria share, or many types of bacteria share, fungi share with each other, and so forth and so on. And your second lines of defense have developed ways to recognize these microorganisms immediately. So your pathogens that we learned about in Chapter 11 have developed various strategies to get around the second line of defense. That's why they're capable of causing disease. So again, prior exposure is not required, and you've got leukocytes that are involved in inflammation and phagocytosis. So inflammation and phagocytosis will be two processes we'll be talking about here in Chapter 12. Then your second lines of defense also have some chemical weapons that we'll talk about at the end of the chapter that include proteins and a special set of proteins called complement proteins. And then you've got these processes, phagocytosis and inflammation, that I just mentioned. Then fever is a process of your second line of defense as well. So let's do an overview of your leukocytes, or your white blood cells. First of all, your white blood cells can be divided up into two broad categories. You have your granulocytes and your agranulocytes. Granulocytes refers to the presence of these little membrane-covered packages or granules that are present in the cytoplasms of these cells. And so when you look at them under the microscope, they look like they have little dots on the inside. And again, those are actually membrane-covered vesicles that contain chemicals that these cells use to help fight infection. So you have three white blood cell types that are considered to be granulocytes: neutrophils, basophils, and eosinophils. Then you have your agranulocytes. This means without granules. So when you look at these under the microscope, when they've been stained in a special way that lights up the granules present in these cells, you don't really see the granules in lymphocytes or monocytes, and so they're called agranulocytes. So you want to know those categories and which ones fall into each. Now, if you were in a laboratory and you were looking at a blood smear under the microscope, this is a pretty good representation of what you would see. So most of the cells that you're seeing, of course, are your red blood cells, because they're by far the most abundant of these formed elements in the blood. And then see these little purple things, like right there, little flecks over here? There's a couple of them. Those are platelets, and they're really just cell fragments that are involved in blood clotting and inflammation. And then here's an example of a white blood cell, and that's actually a neutrophil. So you kind of see there's some pink spots in the cytoplasm, and those are the granules, or little membrane-covered vesicles that are full of chemicals. So that's why neutrophils fall into this granulocyte category. So you can see that they're larger than your red blood cells typically. This darker purple area is the nucleus, so it has kind of a funny-shaped nucleus as well. But if you were looking at a blood smear of a healthy person under the microscope, you have to kind of scan around, because you're going to see tons of red blood cells, but those white blood cells really only make up about 1% of the cell population in the blood, so they're going to be kind of scattered around. And incidentally, these cells don't naturally have these colors. They are dyed. Remember, you guys learned about staining as part of your Learn Smart laboratory activity. So there are there's a pink dye and a purple dye that are used simultaneously on a blood cell preparation, and it causes your different kinds of white blood cells staying with different patterns, and that helps you with identification. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about neutrophils. So neutrophils are a type of granulocyte. They're highly phagocytic, very good at phagocytosis, And like your other white blood cell types, they're able to get out of the blood and into tissues through a process known as diapedesis. And that's kind of drawn over here. So this is a tissue. These little gold things are coccus-shaped bacteria, and that's a neutrophil. And you can see there it's capturing those bacteria and starting the process of phagocytosis. And here's another neutrophil over here. This is a capillary, a microscopic blood vessel with a very thin single-celled wall. And so there's a neutrophil that's undergoing diapedesis. It's actually squeezing through the slits that are present in the capillary wall so they can come out into the tissues and help find these evil bacteria. There's another name for these. They're also called polymorphonuclear cells, or PMN, so you might hear people refer to these cells with that name. So I want you guys to be familiar with it in case you hear that terminology used. And now you can kind of break down this word and figure out what it means. Poly is many. Morph refers to structure. You know, we've heard about morphology before. And then nuclear referring to the nucleus. Okay, so basically what this is telling you is it has a multi-shaped nucleus. And really it's referred to as a multi-lobed nucleus. So here's an example neutrophil that you might see on a blood smear that's been dyed. And so that's all one nucleus. I know it kind of looks like a string of, like a balloon animal or something like that. But it's one nucleus. It's just divided up into lobes, and you've got thinner areas in between. So that's where the DNA is located. And why is the nucleus shaped like that? I had a student who asked me that last semester, and the scientists don't really know. Some people think maybe it's shaped like that to help those cells squeeze out of the nucleus. And you'll see that most of your white blood cells have kind of an odd-shaped nucleus, but not all of them. So apparently it's not essential. But apparently we don't know yet why they have this kind of odd-shaped nucleus. Neutrophils, very good phagocytes, so keep that in mind. And strong levels of activity against bacteria. These are sometimes called bacteria slayers. They're very good at identifying and doing phagocytosis on bacteria. So I want you guys to keep that. When you're thinking neutrophils, think very good at swarming in and attacking bacteria. Not all bacteria, though. Remember, your pathogenic bacteria have various strategies that they use to avoid phagocytosis early in infection. So your good pathogens are generally going to be able to escape from neutrophils. A couple of terms you guys should be familiar with: neutrophilia and neutropenia. Whenever you see this philia suffix associated with cells, it's referring to elevated levels, and penia refers to abnormally low levels. So neutropenia, abnormally low levels of neutrophils. Neutrophilia, abnormally high levels of neutrophils. Neutrophilia is often a good sign of a bacterial infection, and the reason for that is because these cells are so good at fighting bacteria, doing phagocytosis on bacteria. When you have a bacterial infection, there are chemical signals that are sent from the area of inflammation, the area of infection, that travel to the bone marrow and instruct the bone marrow to crank out more neutrophils. So when we were learning about hematopoiesis, and we talked about those stem cells and how they go down different pathways to make different blood cell types, if you have a bacterial infection, very often your bone marrow will start producing, it'll send more of those unspecialized blood cells down the neutrophil pathway, and so you can develop neutrophilia. Neutrophils aren't very long-lived, so when they migrate into an area where an infection is taking place, and they'll swarm in and do phagocytosis on a lot of bacteria, but then they die pretty quickly. So you need more neutrophils to come in and help you fight the infection. Another thing I want to point out here, where it says neutrophils 60 to 70%, that means that among your white blood cells, not all of your blood cells, white blood cells only make up 1% of your blood cell population, but out of that 1%, neutrophils are 60 to 70% of your white blood cell population. So they're very abundant. You've always got a lot of those in your blood. And so therefore, when you have an infection going on somewhere, they're going to be among the first responders. They're sometimes referred to as first responders because there's so many of them. They're the first ones to get out of the blood and go into a tissue and help you fight infection. Oops. Skip a slide. My computer's being kind of wonky today. I guess I did not. Alright, I'm supposed to have a video here of neutrophils exiting the bloodstream. It doesn't look like it's showing up. Let me see if I can pull it up on. Okay, yeah, I found a video I was looking for. This is a neutrophil moving to the site of infection. You can Google that or look it up on YouTube if you want to take another look at this. But this is supposed to be a neutrophil that is traveling through the bloodstream inside a blood vessel. It's traveling, it's traveling, it's going, it's going, it's going. Yeah, and then this is an actual video of a small blood vessel in a real tissue. Video taken under a microscope. So you can kind of see these little blobs that you see here. Those are neutrophils inside a blood vessel. And this is some surrounding connective tissue where we probably have an infection going on. And if you look really carefully, now we've got neutrophils that have come out of the blood and into the tissue, and they're wandering around inside the tissue. So all these little fibery things, those are the collagen and elastic fibers and so forth you guys learn about in Biology 201. But they're in there searching for microorganisms to engulf. Now we're back to the cartoon. So again, here's a neutrophil traveling through the bloodstream. And notice that it's slowing down and it's rolling along the inside wall of the blood vessel. Going through kind of a rolling motion, and these things that are sticking up here that kind of look like blades of grass, those are signaling molecules that are produced along the inside wall of the blood vessel when you're in an area where an infection is taking place in the surrounding tissue. So there are basically signals that are sent to the blood vessel walls that send up like these little spikes that make the neutrophils stop. So that way the neutrophils know where they're supposed to exit. This is how they know to go into a particular tissue area to help fight an infection. So here you're seeing the blood vessel walls dilating so that the neutrophil here will be able to squeeze through the wall. And it's now into the connective tissue. So you see all those snaky things are the collagen and elastic fibers you guys learn about. And now it's oozing around through the tissue, and it has encountered some green bacteria over here, and it's going to do phagocytosis. Although, okay, so you guys can take a look at other videos on YouTube if you want to find them. There are lots of animations out there that are really cool. Let's take a look at these different white blood cell types and how they carry out their actions. All right, so neutrophils were one type of granulocyte. The other two types are basophils and eosinophils. And they're not nearly as abundant in the blood as the neutrophils. So here's a basophil, 0.5 to 1% of your white blood cells are this type, eosinophils 2 to 4%. So you don't have nearly as many of these circulating in your blood as you do the neutrophils. What basophils do, now they also migrate into your tissues by diapedesis. So if you have an injury or an infection somewhere, there are going to be little signals that are sent to the blood vessels in that area. So they send up those little spikes that tell these white blood cells where to exit, where to get out of the blood and into the surrounding tissue. What basophils do is they're kind of alarm bell sounders. So they release factors that stimulate inflammation. So things like histamine and heparin, we'll talk more about those when we discuss inflammation. You probably learned about histamine in anatomy and physiology. So that's one of the things that's responsible for stimulating the vasodilation, the dilation of the blood vessels, and making them leakier in an area where you need all of these nice things to come out of the blood and help you clean up an injury or fight an infection. They're very similar to the mast cells that permanently reside in tissue. So you may have studied mast cells in Biology 201 when you went over tissue. So if you have an injury or an infection, mast cells and basophils detect the injury and or the infection, and then they secrete all these chemicals they've got stored in their granules, and that basically maintains and continues the inflammatory response. And you need that to continue until the infection has cleared and or the injury has been repaired. So basophils are involved in stimulation, maintaining an inflammatory response. All right, eosinophils, They have large granules, little membrane-covered packages of chemicals, and kind of the key thing to remember with them is they're very involved in fighting off parasitic worms or helminths. Then they're also involved in allergies. Basophils are involved in allergies as well, as we'll see when we get to chapter 14. But those are kind of the two key things to keep in mind with eosinophils. Eosinophils will attach to parasitic worms, and then they dump out all these horrible chemicals that are designed to try to kill the parasitic worm. So thinking about that from a kind of a clinical applied standpoint, we talked about how if you have a bacterial infection, you may develop neutrophilia. If you have eosinophilia, that's often a sign of a parasitic worm infestation. And or it can be a sign that you're having some sort of an allergic reaction. Eosinophils will also do phagocytosis, but they're not as good at that as neutrophils or macrophages. Incidentally, back thinking about the neutrophils from a couple of minutes ago, we talked about pus back in chapter 11, abscesses, and when you see that kind of off-white accumulation of gunk around a wound. A lot of that color is coming from neutrophils that swarm in to do phagocytosis, mainly against bacteria that might be present there. And they don't live very long, they die, and so those dead neutrophils accumulate there, and that's where a lot of that kind of off-white color of the pus is coming from. All right, so those were our granulocytes: neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils, or granulocytes. Your agranulocytes include monocytes and lymphocytes. Okay, so they're not going to have the granules, or not as obvious spottiness in the cytoplasm when you look at them under the microscope. Lymphocytes, about 20 to 25% of your white blood cell population. Monocytes, about 3 to 8% of your white blood cell population. And monocytes are large, generally, and the nucleus is kind of horseshoe-shaped. A lymphocyte, almost the entire volume of the cell is the nucleus. They'll have just like a little sliver of cytoplasm around the edge, and they're not much bigger than a typical red blood cell that you see on the rest of the diagram there. The lymphocytes over here, those are your main cells of the third line of defense, adaptive or specific immunity. Then you have another special type of lymphocyte called an NK cell, or a natural killer cell, and so we'll talk a little bit about those when we get into chapter 13 as well. Monocytes in the blood, when they squeeze through blood vessel walls and get into a tissue, they become wandering macrophages. Okay, and so they're very good at phagocytosis. They're professional phagocytes. They tend to become elevated in levels later during infection. Your neutrophils are kind of your first responders for phagocytosis. Macrophages come in later. And those dendritic cells we've talked about that are stationed in your skin and your mucous membranes also develop from monocytes. So depending on your needs, some monocytes become macrophages, some will become dendritic cells. All right, that was kind of a quick overview of these white blood cell warriors of the immune system. And again, the lymphocytes we're not really going to emphasize in this chapter. We're going to talk a lot more about those when we get into chapter 13. We'll probably talk more about them than you would ever want to talk about them when we get into that particular chapter. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, your second lines of defense include a number of processes: phagocytosis, inflammation, and fever. So our next few video clips, we're going to take a look at those three processes. Some of this information will be reviewed, but we'll be including a few more details than we've had earlier in this particular class.